So good evening, everyone. I'm excited and honored to be sharing the stage tonight with our speaker and guest, Dr. Deborah Lipstadt, and to be both celebrating the publication of her new book, her new and vitally important book, Antisemitism Here and Now, which came out in February, and as well as to talk about many of the key ideas in the book, in which Deborah both provides a kind of overview in narrative and dialogical form about all of the forms of anti-Semitism on display in the world now, and what it means for Jews and others to respond to these accusations, to take bold and courageous stances, and to try to lead to a different type of conversation about the issues that they present and what it represents. I'm honored to share the stage with you because there are very few great Jewish historians. There are very few great Jewish historians who play an active role as a participant in Jewish history, and there are really very, very few even of that group, probably none, except for you, who are also protagonist heroes in the story of Jewish history. So kol hakavod.
Someone on Facebook just called me faint-hearted.
Faint-hearted.
I don't usually respond to comments, but I said, that's a hoot.
Faint-hearted, yeah. The other thing that I want, just not a name, and I won't do your whole bio here tonight, but it is also an extraordinary thing in the ways that our sages say, Ezehu chacham haroeh et hanolad, who is the wise person who can see things as they're happening or before they're happening. And so obviously many of us have known that anti-Semitism has been on the rise and never really went away, but it was really courageous, provocative, and visionary to put this book out now and to try to guide to a new Jewish conversation. So I wanted tonight, our folks here in our programs have been studying nationalism, tribalism for the past week in all sorts of ways, and the question of anti-Semitism has emerged at various places, and I think tonight is an opportunity for us to dig into some of the places that it's manifesting, some of your theses that you put forward in the book, and to offer some conceptual frames for us to be able to take home. And I'll ask a bunch of questions, and then we'll open up to whatever we missed in discussion here. I guess I wanted to start by asking you about the trends that are not specific to the Jewish community and not specific to anti-Semitism itself. We study anti-Semitism because it has this really long history and because it metastasizes in all of these different ways. But there also must be geopolitical trends at play that are fueling and mobilizing this form of hate, as well as other forms of hates that other peoples are experiencing. So I guess I want to know, what do we need to understand about what has brought us collectively and globally to this present moment in terms of these trends, and how and why did this conversation reemerge?
Why are we talking about this?
Why are we talking about this
3 years ago, if you had been planning your program 3 years out, and maybe you do, we never would have imagined that this would be such a centerpiece. Some of you may have read or heard me describe, and I do this in all seriousness and not in humor, that I see anti-Semitism as akin to a herpes virus. If you've ever known anyone who has had herpes, or you're a doc and you've treated it, or a medical person, you know that once you get that virus, now there may be some medications that deal with, but up until recently, it never goes away. It lies dormant in your body, and it emerges under two circumstances. Stress, the day before you're going for an interview, you suddenly get a herpes sore, the day before your wedding, or something like that, or hospitable environment. You have an infection in your body, and it finds that infection, or you have a place where whatever it might be, there's something in your body, and the herpes virus finds it and breeds there, and then you have an outbreak. And I really think that works in terms of anti-Semitism. It's interesting. I first came up with that on the day of Pittsburgh. I got a call from the then religion reporter for the New York, editor for the New York Times. We were on the phone a long time, and she was asking me specifically this question, because there were other people, it's specific to the event, but she wanted this sort of background. And I said to her, Laura, you can describe anti-Semitism is akin to a herpes virus. And the minute I said, no, don't write that. It's too horrible. And she paused and she said, first of all, Deborah, you can't take it off the record after you've said it. She said, but I respect you enough, I would, but I won't because it's really accurate. So what are the stress points and what are the hospitable environment? And I think neither of them have to do specifically with anti-Semitism as such. There's much that does have to do with anti-Semitism. The stress is a changing economy worldwide. I just came from Poland last night. And, you know, Poland has a new far-right-wing government that is very determinedly and I think thoughtfully playing with many things, judiciary, certain freedoms, but also with history. It has, that right-wing government has great support outside the major cities, Warsaw, Krakow, a few other cities, and from people who feel to some degree, and this is a vast generalization, but I think it's part of it, that somehow they've been left behind in the conversation. If you've been to Poland over the past 20 years, you know, or you follow this, you know that it was considered the success story of the post-communist era. I mean, it is an economic miracle. Its economy is booming. Its universities, museums, the Polin in terms of Jewish museums, etc. It was just seen as really moving in a very strongly democratic fashion, and now you have this change. It is a populist trend, and I want to differentiate, and I may be bringing coals to Newcastle, to a group that has been studying this all week, between patriotism and populism, national pride and populism. Populism is something that scares us more because it's far more than patriotism. It's far more than a nationalism. It's a sense of my country right or wrong, my country above all. It's an anger towards other systems, etc., to other countries, etc., etc. So it's a come from the bottom kind of populism from people, some of whom are I don't want to paint it as these are all the people who have been left behind by the economy, because that would be entirely wrong. It would be entirely wrong for the United States. It would be entirely wrong for Poland and for many other places. But amongst some people who feel that there have been deep-seated societal changes and somehow something is happening that they can't quite grasp and they can't quite identify. Now, when you're in that kind of state of not fully being able to put your finger on something that is causing great changes, if someone were to come along to you to sort of play with the famous joke that was told about Jews in Germany and say it was in the 30s, it's the bicycle riders, you would say, you're nuts. But if someone comes along and says to you, it's the Jews, or it's a Jew, George Soros, Rothschild, whomever it might be, it makes sense to you. I mean, because that's the whole nature. I'm really, but I can't answer this just in a straight line. I got to go off on tangents a little bit. Anti-Semitism, as I write in the book, and many of you have heard me say this before, I'm sure, is a prejudice. And prejudice prejudge. Don't confuse me with the facts. I've made up my mind. Prejudice is based on certain stereotypes. We have, in the United States, certain stereotypes about African Americans. We have certain stereotypes about gay people. We have certain stereotypes about different groups, including, and this is not funny at all, pretty young blonde students on campus. And, of course, we have stereotypes about Jews. So if someone comes and says to me, this is that Jew Soros, without even saying that Jew Soros, in Hungary they know, you know, it's Soros, or Soros, then it makes sense. Because you've been programmed just by living in a society to have these certain stereotypes about Jews, money, power, intellect. We can talk about where that comes later if we want. So you find amongst others, a boogeyman, so to speak, that makes sense to you. So I think that that's one part of it. I think the other part, the hospitable atmosphere, is today we have national leaders in many countries. Certainly in the European scene, and some in power, some not yet in power, or hopefully not ever in power. Marine Le Pen in France, Jeremy Corbyn in England. So this is not right or left, friends. This is both sides of the transom, who play on these stereotypes. Sometimes they do it in a very wily fashion. Corbyn is not wily at all. He's just, keeps stepping in it, but he has got enough people around him who try to protect him from it. And they play on that. So I think we have it on both sides. Going back to one of the stress elements, something that so many of you Americans have American connections, but it's, again, not just in America. On the far right, you have this whole, idea of a white Christian genocide. This is not it's a craziness, but this is something that is increasingly getting play. And who is engineering that white Christian genocide? What were they chanting in Charlottesville? Jews will not replace us. It's not that the Jews are replacing them, but the Jews are behind the scenes engineering that. So you have something happening on both sides, and if you were to say this is the fault of the bicycle riders or of the left-handed people or whatever it might be, people would say that's crazy. But if you say it's the result of people who for a long time have been connected with money, power and intellect and money, all used nefariously, all used maliciously, it makes sense.
Okay, so if I take the analogy of it is a virus that is fueled by stress and hospitable environments for the incubation of the virus, I feel pulled in two different directions, and I felt reading the book that you were navigating a fine line between two essential understandings of anti-Semitism. One which says it's a virus, and therefore it has unique properties and unique qualities among all different types of hatreds. And another which argues that anti-Semitism is part of a family of hatreds, and much as there is the rise of anti-Muslim bigotry, a rise of explicit structural racism, right? So instead of just it being under the surface, it's okay to be publicly racist, anti-immigrant sentiment around the globe. Anti-Semitism is part of that family. And I know that I felt that, and I want you to kind of unpack this, you were trying to navigate both of those readings, that there's something essential and essentially different about anti-Semitism, and that there's something that shares property with others.
Yeah. You're right. I did try to do that, and I very much believe in that. One of the reasons, let me start almost backwards, that I tried so hard to do it is one of my objectives is to get people, not the people sitting here, but the rest of the world. There is a rest of the world out there, to take it seriously. Because you look at the Jew and you say, what are you complaining about? What's so bad, etc. But I do believe that anti-Semitism is a prejudice like other prejudices. As I said before, the stereotypes, the pre-existing idea. Jonathan Crane, whom you may know, is a colleague of mine at Emory, Rabbi Jonathan Crane, Professor Jonathan Crane, once said to me something which I actually quote in the book and give him credit for, is you meet the stereotype in front of your nose when the person is still 2 blocks away. So that's true of all prejudices. But Manishtana, how is anti-Semitism different? I think it's different in a number of ways. One way is its long roots. Yes, there's anti-Muslim bigotry, there's no question about it, but my butt is not to diminish it where it has emerged, but it is directly linked to political situations. You didn't have it that way 100 years, 60 years, 40 years, maybe even less years ago. That doesn't mean it's not serious. That doesn't mean that a young girl or an older woman or anyone in between walking down the street in hijab should feel threatened, but it is a politically linked thing. Anti-Semitism is different in it having these long tentacles which have their root, to my mind, in the New Testament and the way in which the New Testament was taught over millennia. You can argue whether it's really there in the New Testament or just was interpreted, but it's certainly interpreted in a very distinctive fashion by church, I'll say fathers, sometimes mothers too. So that makes it a little different, makes it very different. And then it makes it different also in that it migrated from the church to people who were opponents of the church. Voltaire in the 17th century. Voltaire had contempt for the church, particularly how it played its power in France. And yet, if you read his comments about the Jews, you can see it, Arthur Hertzberg's famous book, or you can just Google Voltaire and the Jews, and Mrs. Google will show you all the different ways in which Voltaire engaged in overt anti-Semitism. It sounded like it was coming out of someone who was a traditional church leader. Go past Voltaire. Go to the 19th century. You have the eugenicists who are dealing in this pseudo-scientific way, Houston Stewart Chamberlain and others. And they lay the groundwork for what the Nazis will eventually use, this scientific notion about Jews and their powers, Jews and their characteristics, which are just the same as you had being taught by the church fathers, but in a scientific, al tistakel b'kankan al masha b'tocho, don't look at the jar, look at what's in the jar, the same stuff in the jar, but new a covering. And then go to someone who's a Verbrennte opponent of religion, Karl Marx. So you have this old hatred with tentacles in different ways, coming from the right, coming from the left. You have, the protocols of the Elders of Zion from the Tsarist police, and then you have the Russian Revolution and anti-Semitism from those on the left. So I think that already gives it difference. This long trail, ubiquitous nature or adaptable nature, going back again to my adaptable nature, adapting to new situations. So I think that's one thing that makes it different from others. The other thing that makes it different is the conspiracy theory aspect of anti-Semitism. And here, that may be best understood by comparing anti-Semitism to racism. The racist and the anti-Semite, and usually they're one and the same, but the racist looks at the person of color, black, brown, whatever, and says, if they move into our neighborhoods, if their kids go to our kids' schools, they're going to bring us down. They're going to diminish us because they are lesser than us. If they get a position in a school, did they really get it on merit, or did they get it by virtue of redress or something like that? Because they would never be capable of getting it on their own. So the racist is afraid of the person of color because of their ability to bring them down. The anti-Semite, and remember, I'm talking one and the same here almost always, looks at the Jew and says the Jew is all powerful. The Jew has this ability to manipulate. This Jew, that's again why Soros is so useful as a figure, and there are others, of course, as well. The Jew does these things, and I can't quite tell where that power is coming from. So what I like to say is the racist punches down, the anti-Semite punches up. Punches up because I'm afraid of what they're going to do. If you remember from The Eternal Jew, one of the Nazi propaganda films, there's that famous scene of, and it's used in many documentaries, of a young Jew with beard and payas and kapata, and suddenly first the kapata is changed for a suit, and the shtreimel goes, and the payas disappear, and the beard is cut off, and suddenly, and they say, now you can't recognize him. And the next scene is supposedly Berlin Jews, very, in tuxedos, evening dress, drinking champagne, looking very respectable, but you can't identify them. So that's the punching up part.
I guess what concerns me is one of the moral costs that inevitably comes. It doesn't have to, but it does inevitably arise, is that the attempt to differentiate anti-Semitism from other things, even if we're trying to say it's not better, it's not worse, it's different, is that inevitably the attempt to characterize anti-Semitism as something different than all other forms of hatred elevates it as of being paramount importance. And I want to get later to the question of a Jewish communal agenda around anti-Semitism. But I guess I'm particularly interested in this question in thinking about the American Jewish experience. One of my colleagues shared with me a hypothesis recently, which I think sounds right, but it needs a lot of work, which is that the Jew has functioned as an other for the West to enable the West to be what it is. And the West needs the Jew as the other. And the American Jewish experience has involved Jews arriving with that otherness into a society where we are much less other, but where we have found a different other upon which America has structured itself, which is black people.
I think
And so what makes me concerned about the interrogation of the difference between anti-Semitism and racism is that it almost insists that we continue to prioritize the differentiation of anti-Semitism instead of what may be a much more significant structural concern for Americans, which is structural racism against black people.
First of all, I think you can't be against one ism without being against all isms. So that, differentiating, that's what scholars do. When we look, to say to, come on, Yehuda,
there's an Onion, my favorite Onion story of all time is just says, professor sees similarities between things, other things. So
right.
That's your
and that's what we do. Now, it's true. I have heard people say, I'm not interested in other prejudices, just anti-Semitism. I don't think you can be. It may start with the Jew. It doesn't end with the Jew. If it starts with others, it's going to come back to the Jew. So I think that's one point that's important. I think in many respects, and yes, in America today, racism is a much more overt kind of issue. I describe a situation in the book when talking about this, where on a Friday night, a bunch of us, a number of families, friends, had gathered, and it was what we call that pregnant pause between everybody getting there in time for Kiddush. Some people were coming from services, some people were just late. They said they were coming from services, but we knew better. And we were just standing around in the kitchen. Some of us had already started imbibing. And in a corner, a mother was gently but firmly berating her teenage son for having come home so late the night before. He's a high school student, but he had gone to a fraternity party in an edgy part of town, and she was saying, you really should have called, you really should have let us know, it's not a smart thing, whatever, etc. And he said to her, Ma, you don't understand. When we left the party, first of all, 4 of us guys left together. And as soon as we walked out, a police car saw us and started to follow us as we walked to the car. And then it followed us as we left the neighborhood till we got on the highway to go home. And he was trying to reassure his mother. And I was thinking, if he had been black, that would not have been reassuring at all, So, of course, there is something more overt and something different. So I'm not trying to, say, oh, this is a bigger problem than others. I think it is different. I think when, to use the Talmudic example, when your ox is gored, you're always you're more sensitive to it. But I think there's another reason, and it goes back to my saying that I want people to take anti-Semitism seriously. One of the problems on the progressive left, and I'm not saying everyone on the progressive left, and it's not just on the progressive left, but we see this most clearly on the progressive left, in someone like a Jeremy Corbyn and many of those people around him, their view of prejudice is refracted through a prism. And remember, prisms bend light. Remember high school physics? Prism, maybe even college physics, prisms bend light. And that prism has a number of facets. One facet is ethnicity. One facet is class. And a third facet that sort of flows from the first two, so my prism analogy breaks down a little, but that's all right, is power. And they look on the Jew and they see a white person, even though on the far right, they don't see white people, you know. What was the murderer in Pittsburgh yelling as he was being brought down by the SWAT team? You're not going to destroy, to the Jews he was killing, you're not going to destroy the white race. What was the guy in Poway in San Diego County yelling? A similar kind of thing. And when the police arrested him, that's when he was on this rant about how Jews were destroying the white race. So that's the terrible irony. On the far right, Jews are not seen as white. But on the left, that you look at the Jew and you say, oh, you're white, you can pass, you have a choice, etc. So you're white, and then they look and they see someone who is supposedly privileged, even though we know there are many Jews who are not privileged, and we also know that if you factor for education, Jews are no more privileged than any other group that is as educated as Jews. So we know those things, but those are rational things and not emotional things. So you look at the Jew and you see someone who is privileged, supposedly privileged and white. Ipso facto, they have power. Someone with power cannot be a victim of prejudice, says some of the people on the progressive left. And then the second layer, and you very much see this with Corbyn and those around him, but not hardly only that. Corbyn will always talk about how his mother marched at Cable Street with the anti-fascist demonstrations in London in the 30s. So, you know, what he's saying, of course, is that I absorbed my anti-fascist, anti-racist, anti-prejudice, anti-Semitic qualities, with my mother's milk, since childhood. Or someone who was a refugee might say that, or someone who is from a group that is often the object of prejudice, Muslim group, whatever. How could I possibly be prejudiced? So, therefore, your charge against me that I am engaging in prejudice and in anti-Semitism, when you have privilege and you have power and you have standing and you're white, and I couldn't possibly have these kind of emotions. Your charges have no ground to them. They're illegitimate. Therefore, you must be doing them or saying them or leveling them for ulterior purposes. Now, what could be those ulterior purposes? Sometimes a person will say Israel. When the topic has nothing to do with Israel, sometimes we see this in the United Kingdom, it's to bring Corbyn down, whatever it might be. So not only are you not a victim, but you're using this victimhood to claim victims, or the supposed suffering, to claim victim status, but you have that ulterior purpose.
So one of the things I liked most in the book is when, as you've said here multiple times tonight, anti-Semitism can manifest regardless of your political ideology, wherever you are in the political map. And one of the sloppy ways that gets played out in America is the minute I start talking about an anti-Semite here, if that's your political party, you're going to try to identify anti-Semites on my political side. So then we're not really talking about anti-Semites, it's just color war, right? But one of the things I liked about your book was that when you were surfacing the ways in which you said, it doesn't matter whether Donald Trump is an anti-Semite. Here are the ways in which he has given room for, or amplified, or emboldened anti-Semitism. And the contrast that you used, which was powerful, was Corbyn. So it wasn't an attempt to try to kind of create an equalization within two societies. It was to notice that regardless of the political ideology where it manifests, this can come up. So I appreciated that.
I think that that's crucial. And I think too often anti-Semitism, including amongst people who really care about anti-Semitism, becomes, you call it a food fight, a political weapon, it's the weaponizing of it. So that there's an event, there's a tragedy in Poway in the Chabad Shul in San Diego County, and a right-wing Republican leader tweets, "This is awful." And when we have people like Representative Omar saying the things she's saying, that gives rise to this thing. Lo dubim v'lo yar, there's a saying in Hebrew. There were no bears and there was no forest, but otherwise the story is absolutely true, I mean, it was like boom. Or flipping to the other side, to be an equal opportunity critic, on the day of Pittsburgh, Dame Jenny Tong, a very far left member of the House of Lords, a hater of Israel, and I don't use that term lightly, tweeted, "What happened in Pittsburgh is a tragedy. When will Netanyahu learn that his policies had nothing to do with Israel?" But there was that kind of a thing. So you see it from both sides. I'll give you a more recent example. I think about 10 days ago, maybe 2 weeks now, there was a dyke parade in Detroit. And at that parade, some people were carrying pride flags with the Jewish star, Magen David, and some were carrying Israeli flags. And the neo-Nazis who were present came and urinated on the flags. So this is, a gay effort, and here are these neo-Nazis coming into. Or another example that cuts closer to home, my friend David Irving, and that's friend in big quotation marks, recently said in an interview to some reporter that he liked Jeremy Corbyn. He was impressed by Jeremy Corbyn. Now, there is nothing in terms of policies that the two of them agree on, except maybe, and this is not unrelated, opposition to the EU and anti-Semitism. So it's not that, I've said very often, and I'm beginning to refine it and change it, and I'll probably, when I do the introduction, when there's a paperback edition, I'll put this in. It's not that there's anti-Semitism on the right and there's anti-Semitism on the left. There's anti-Semitism, and both the right and the left glomp onto it because their vision of anti-Semitism, their interpretation, the stereotypes they use are the same. Money, intellect, power used nefariously. And there's one other element there that you'll appreciate, because I know you're a student of theology and religion, and this has its roots in anti-Semitism as it emerges in the Middle Ages, but it really, again, migrates outside of the concept of religion. Trachtenberg's book from ages ago, what is it, The Devil and the Jews, and Joshua Trachtenberg talks about, I think it's from the 40s, isn't it? It talks about how the Jew was demonized. Well, who is the demon in Christian theology? The demon, A, is the only one who can harm God, and B, the demon has the ability to disguise himself so that you don't know you've been dealing with the demon till after the demon is gone and you are left with the damages. So again, that goes back to whether it's a Rothschild, whether it's a Soros, whether it's manipulation of the banks, that you don't know who's doing it and you don't know till after it's happened.
So one of the places where this plays out, which happens much more as a question of the progressive left in America than it is asked of the right, and I want to probe that a little bit, is on the question of coalitions. And the assumption that if you're in coalition with someone, even if it is for a third purpose, right? That and you make reference to this, and I really wanted to go deeper.
March.
You didn't. I don't think you mentioned. I don't know if you remember the Women's March.
Women's March, I mentioned a little, and then I've written about it.
Right. You said in the book at some point, I won't make common cause, essentially with anti-Semites. It reminds me of Avishai Margalit's. There's the morality of compromise all the way until you've reached the point of rotten compromise, and you have to be really careful about getting to that point. And I wonder how risk-averse Jews are meant to be, because the more concerned I am about you can never make common cause with the anti-Semite, it might incline me towards a politics of refusal to partner with other groups because I'm nervous about anti-Semite. There's a kind of like the minute we get into litmus testing, then we wind up not being in spaces that are really important for Jews politically. And just to up the ante a little bit, it's the conversation in America around coalitions tends to be around the progressive left. You mentioned the Women's March. But the perhaps much more pressing question as we're sitting here in Israel are coalitions between the State of Israel and the Polish government and the Hungarian government, etc. So when is it okay for us to be, as the Jewish people, in coalition because we say there may be anti-Semites among us, but there's something larger that we're willing to engage with? And when is it legitimate for us to be critical of the Israeli government for exactly these reasons? How do we do this?
Yeah, let me start with the left and the Women's March, because that's where it came most explicitly. Maybe, and it's a very big maybe, I could work with the leaders of the Women's March, such as they are now constituted, if we all lived on the same street and we were worried about getting a traffic light on the street because our kids or our grandkids were getting hit by cars. But to ask me to march behind them on an issue fighting prejudice, on an issue fighting stereotypes, on an issue fighting unfair attacks, when they themselves have engaged in the worst kind of that stereotyping and demonization, is just impossible. I'm not saying the efforts and the cause of the Women's March is bad. Absolutely not. I stand behind it 120%. And if I had been in the country, I was out of the country at that point, I would have marched in a local march. But, you know, I can't make common cause with people I know who are looking at me and think of me and my people in a certain way, and then I'm going, especially if they're in the leadership. Now, the sad thing is, again, staying on the left, that what's happening on many campuses is that it's not a choice of the Jewish student. They go to the Green Coalition or they go to the anti-racist coalition, and this is McCarthyism of the left. They are asked to give their bona fides. You're a member of Hillel? You support Israel? You can't be with us in the Green Coalition. You're a member of Hillel, you support Israel, you can't be with us in the anti-racist coalition. So if anything, it's happening, you know, in that way. In terms of the right, and I do talk about it in the book, and I talked about it publicly before 450 people in Krakow just 48 hours ago, and I talked about it in a number of interviews I did. That I am terribly troubled by the current government of Israel's making common cause with a Viktor Orban, the current government in Hungary, the current government in Poland. Where did he just go into Latvia, Lithuania? You know, countries.
America.
Yeah, that I think is more complicated. That's a more complicated issue, but. You know, look, I understand realpolitik. You know, nothing I say here is going to determine someone's life. Nothing I say here is going to affect the security of a nation. And I recognize that. And sometimes, you know, politics makes strange bedfellows. Sometimes if you are in charge of a nation, if you're the leader of a nation, you can't afford to take these principled, you know, stands. But if you're going to make common cause with the Polish government, which is engaged in what I call softcore Holocaust denial, not denying the facts, but rewriting the facts, hiding the facts of the tens of thousands, and there's serious historians who say hundreds of thousands of close to 100,000 Jews who were killed by Poles, in the wartime period, etc. If you're going to do that, then do not have the chutzpah to claim that you are and your country and the government you lead is the primary defender of Jews on issues of anti-Semitism. I'm sorry, that doesn't work. If you're going to welcome Viktor Orban, who has engaged in a rewriting of Hungarian history, in Hungary, Eichmann arrived in Hungary in third week in March 1944 with fewer than 300 SS officers. And then in the space of 7 weeks, starting in May, going through beginning of July, deported over close to 500,000 Hungarian Jews, of which well over 400,000 were murdered at Auschwitz. It's that murder that gives Auschwitz its dubious status as the world's largest killing fields. Eichmann didn't do that alone. He did that with the support of Hungarian railways, gendarmes, police, government officials, people on the street, etc., etc. Do not welcome Viktor Orban to Israel and proclaim him a fighter against anti-Semitism. I'm sorry. You can't have it both ways in that way. So we see it on the right, we see it on the left. And, am I painting a picture where I'm going to go off riding into alone? No, but I think that, and sometimes you have to make compromises. Life is full of compromises, but there's a point, ad can, and until this point, no further.
So I want to come back to campus, but I want to stay on the use of the Shoah for a second, because you brought up the history in Hungary, and a question that is now back in the news about the appropriateness, the legitimacy of analogies to the Shoah. You, in the book, when you're talking about contemporary rise of anti-Semitism in Germany, you eschew comparisons between current anti-Semitism in Germany and that in the past. You differentiate between what you call state-sponsored and not state-sponsored. I guess I'm wondering, and now this came up in American political discourse around the question of around the use of terminology of concentration camps, where you have arguments about whether the term exclusively refers to that of the Jews, or whether once it's post-Shoah, there's no way to hear the word concentration camp without thinking that that's what we're making comparisons to. And I guess I'm wondering, and this is now bridging from not just your scholarship on anti-Semitism, but on Holocaust memory and denial, there is a long-standing Jewish sensibility, especially post-Shoah, but well before, that we are the people that does make comparisons, because that's how we remember. We are constantly vigilant to notice the same patterns, structural, ideological, and otherwise, and then to be super hyper-vigilant, to be the people of never again, to prevent this from happening. And it's very confusing, I think, to many younger Jews that to see the organized Jewish community respond with so vociferously, no, you can't make any comparisons. Is it just because it wasn't us?
No, I think
or is there something else at play?
I think, first of all, it was who was saying it, and that person has rankled a lot of people up until now, but more than just that. First of all, she used the term concentration camps and then said never again. So never again is something, even though never again is a fallacy, if you think about it, it's been again and again and again and again, but never again is something associated directly with the Shoah. So you couldn't say, I was talking about the Boer, from South Africa, the Boer concentration camps or things like that. Number one. Number two, I think things can be terrible. Things can be horrible. I think the way the children have been treated at the borders of our countries is nightmarish, and we should be all losing sleep over it, that you had a representative of our government in court arguing whether giving children warm blankets and not having them sleep on the concrete floor and letting them have access to toothbrushes are safe and sanitary conditions, and how many hours you could have that and it'd be okay. Or we're the richest country in the world and we can't get toothbrushes to them. I mean, it makes no sense. It's just horrific. But that's different than state-sponsored persecution. And often when people say to me, is what we're seeing now the precursor to a Shoah, I say, I don't think so, because when there was Pittsburgh or when the other incidents, governments condemned it. Yes, there are governments that are dealing in and using anti-Semitism, but we're not. What we saw in the Shoah was a state, a regime, engage in a attempted genocide outside the boundaries of their country, through the whole European continent and to Rhodes and Corfu and off and to Libya. So it's a different kind of thing. But I was troubled by her use of that. But I was equally troubled by the vim and the vigor of the people who came down on her, and who lost sight of the whole issue and were only, she's at fault and I'm going to take her to a concentration, and used it and in some way only proved her point on other things. And I wrote about this a year ago in The Atlantic, and as soon as this happened, without my even remembering it, The Atlantic was tweeting about it. But I wrote that something can be horrible without being a Shoah, A, and B, making these kinds of comparisons. And actually what had prompted the article in the Atlantic was the children policy, because it began to be discussed a year ago, became evident a year ago. But Michael Hayden, who was in the George W. Bush administration as the one of the first, I think, secretaries of Homeland Security, had said this is like the Holocaust, and had tweeted a picture of the gates of Birkenau. So I said something could be horrible. So in other words, someone from the more conservative side of the picture. Something can be horrible without being a Holocaust. So it has a moral wrong in making that comparison, but it's also strategically not wise to make that comparison. Why? Because the whole conversation has been about, is it the same? Is it different? Is it not the same? Is it not, instead of, it's wrong, let's do something about it. So, see, I think, Yehuda, on some level, we're in and again, I don't use this term lightly, but I hope it's not misunderstood. We're in a war on this issue. And if you want to fight it, you got to do so not in a way that just makes you feel good, but you got to fight it strategically.
I want to just push back a little bit. And the pushback is that the way that the Jewish people have used memory for and our history, because we did memory long before we did history. The way we've done it is we have turned the historical events that happened to us into moral obligations. We used ritual as a means of amplifying those moral obligations. We use recitation. We falsify the actual story in order to be able to describe, in every generation, Jews figured out how to talk about the Exodus from Egypt in ways that it would be directly applicable to the struggles they were having. And I heard in many who, independent of the congressman using this phrase, congresswoman, that said, member of Congress, used this phrase, independent of that, are actually gravitating towards this language, not because they want to reduce the significance of the Shoah, but precisely because they actually are looking for a means of understanding that which their grandparents had told them, which is, you are responsible, you're obligated. And when the Holocaust Museum of all institutions issues a press release saying you can never make any comparisons, what's the point of a Holocaust museum? Like, why in Washington?
I don't think it was I happen to be a big fan of the Holocaust Museum, and I think the work that they do is unbelievably good and unbelievably solid, and they're generally so careful on these kind of things. I don't know what the backstory was on that. I think it was a mistake. Because they themselves have issued statements on the Rwanda genocide, on Sudan, on refugee crisis, et cetera, et cetera. So I think there was something else going on, but I don't know what it was. I think that on some level, we think of the Holocaust, and correctly so, as something that happened to us. But on the next level, I think it's important to universalize it. In other words, if I had my druthers, courses on the history of the Holocaust would be given, if these kind of departments existed, in departments of Christian studies. Anti-Semitism would be studied, if these departments existed, in departments of Christian studies, just like racism. Hopefully we'll never have these departments of whites, in other words, rape should not be studied in women's studies departments. But it's the victim who cares about it, the victim who wants it looked at, the victim who wants it taken seriously. So that is what happens. But I think you make comparisons, but then you also, because you want also there to be a universal lesson to say to the world. I mean, I was in Friday, I spent the whole day at Auschwitz-Birkenau. Obviously not my first time, I've been there many times, but you're always come out, diminished in some way if you don't, something's, I don't know, I can't imagine that. But this happened to the body of the Jew, but it should be a lesson to everyone. Jews, here's the irony. I'm just reading a new book on how Germans remember trauma and how the American South remembers trauma, and it sounds like a weird comparison, but I think it's very powerful. But in any case, if Germans universalize, makes me very nervous. It's not for the perpetrator to universalize, but the victim. I think in many cases, women know that rape is not a sexual issue; it's an issue of power. And if this person is choosing his victim as a woman walking down the street, or a woman whatever, and I don't care what she's wearing, it doesn't give him any right to attack her. That same person will use that power in other ways. So what is being said so often, whether it's Jews talking about the Holocaust or it's so many, that yes, it's happening to me, and yes, it happened to my people, and in the lifetime of people still on the face of this earth, 1 out of every 3 Jews was murdered. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, I mean, it's unbelievable. But to see it as only something of concern to us is to diminish it.
So let me ask one last question, then I'll open up to the audience. And this was really something I struggled with in the book, because there was a moment where I read something, I said, yes, I agree with that. And then I read another thing, and I said, yes, I agree with that. And then I felt that they were, in some ways, at odds with each other. And so I was struggling with it. One is that you said, we have to figure out how to fight anti-Semitism without amplifying it and without dignifying it. And on the other hand, throughout the book, you are almost refereeing anti-Semitism by calling it out for what it is. And I am really worried in our public discourse, especially because of the partisan polarization around this question, that there's an instinct out there for people to name it, call it out and see it, and in doing so, amplify it. And so I'm wondering about both the art of doing that, and also to just, maybe you could help us think about, in an era of fake news, who should we be listening to and listening for when we try to become sensitive to this?
No, I faced the same dilemma when I wrote about Holocaust deniers. I didn't choose that topic. Here in Jerusalem, up on Har HaTzofim, I was visiting with Professor Yehuda Bauer and Professor Yisrael Gutman Zal, 2 of the great scholars of the Holocaust. Professor Gutman, a survivor of the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, etc. And they said to me, Deborah, we think you should study Holocaust denial. And I laughed. I said, what? You take that serious. And they thought, yes. And if these 2 guys were saying they take it seriously, I thought at that point, okay, I'll look at it. They offered me a grant, which also sweetened the pot a little bit. And I'll spend 2-3 years on it. Was I ever wrong about that? But as I wrote about it, I said, I'm writing about this phenomenon, which I think is crazy, but am I calling attention to it? Sometimes we have that problem, where And sometimes, but as I was writing it, at one point there was going to be a rally. I think even David Irving was going to be there in Decatur, Georgia, right, adjacent to Atlanta, right, 2 miles from where I live. And one of my students came to me and said, we're organizing a group to go and protest and yell and scream. And I said, don't. I don't think there's going to be anyone there. And I think if you go and yell and scream, the press will be there and they'll have a story. Sometimes eit ledaber ve'eit lishtok. There's a time to speak and a time to be silent. As Dylan and maybe some other source once said, it's a choice. It's not an absolute. Sometimes you let something pass and sometimes you have to focus on it. So I think it cuts both ways in that. It's hard to know, and you can't always make the right decision. But sometimes, if a swastika gets painted on the side of a synagogue, sometimes it's time to call the press and make a big fuss, and sometimes it's just time to paint it over and be quiet because you're creating a copycat phenomenon. Can I tell you when to do it and when it's right and when it's wrong? In most cases, no. But I know sometimes we give added ammunition, and sometimes we don't give enough ammunition.
This is really actually the last question because it's a follow-up on this. I wonder whether, and I worry whether some of the noise and attention that's directed to the campus conflicts, especially around BDS, which has been a unsuccessful movement by all measures, except in the minds of Jews who are fighting it. I wonder whether that's one of the sites where the attention driven to it has actually amplified it more than it has successfully named it.
I think it may well be the case. I'm going to be meeting with a group of people from the MFA, not the Museum of Fine Arts, but the Foreign Ministry, and that's one of the things I want to explore. I take it very seriously. But as I say in the book, the object of BDS is not BDS. No, you can't, everyone's going to give up their cell phones, their iPhones, whatever. You're not going to have stents put in, I don't know, whatever, the 130,000 other things that come out of Israel that we depend on. But it's to toxify Israel. And I think, and to make it, so that the kid who goes on birthright, who used to announce it, I'm going on this great trip to Israel, and for 10 days that now will go, but will go quietly. I think that's the problem. I do think things are going to get worse on the campus because I think there's been an upping of the ante. I think that many of these groups have tasted blood and are going to enhance their tactics. It's a strategic. That's why I describe it as a war. Not that it's a war that's affecting our existence. Though that can't say that for 11 people in Pittsburgh. You can't say that for Lori. I'm blocking on her last name. From Poway, or the rabbi who lost a finger and clearly has serious hand injuries. But we have to think strategically, and sometimes I think it's a legacy of the Shoah, and I'll maybe end with this, where we look upon, especially as Americans, we look upon those who came before us, and we say, if I were there, I would have, if I were there, I would have been. I was in Poland traveling around, and I was with some people who said, well, how come there was never a uprising in Lodz? And I heard in the person's questions, even though he wasn't quite aware, if I had been there, I would have. When I teach about the Shoah and we get to resistance, I say to my students, and one of my students is here and actually probably said it in her class, Ariana, you'll remind me, when I got to the question of resistance, I said, I'm going to ask you a question, and I don't want you to answer it. I don't want you to answer it to me or to yourself. Now, that's impossible. If I say, think of blue, don't think of blue. You all, of course, just... So I said, here's the scenario. You're in a ghetto, same age as you are now, younger siblings, old parents the same age, and your parents probably in their 40s, late 40s, early 50s, considered old already in the ghetto. And you're the only one in the family with a work permit, and it's a time when people who had someone in the family with a work permit weren't being deported. And you have a chance to escape Not guaranteed you'll get out, but you know what is going to happen because you know what's going on, and where people who are being deported are being deported to. And you have a chance to escape, but if you do, your family will lose its protection of your work permit. Do you go or do you stay? Don't answer. Because we all are sure that if what I want to instill is a modesty of judgment. If I had been there, I would have. Who the hell knows what we would have done? We don't know because we're not there, and it was so many multifaceted kind of things going on. So I think here too, sometimes there's a sense of, we were silent 70 years ago. I'm not going to be silent again. We didn't react strongly. I'm going to react strongly. I'm not saying we shouldn't react strongly. I mean, I wrote the damn book. I'm going around lecturing about this, talking about it, consulting. So clearly, I think we have to respond, but I think we have to respond wisely and smartly.
Great. Let me open up to thank you. I'm going to take like 3 questions at a time, and then we can answer them together. Go ahead from the front row.
I'm Joyce Stiefel from Bellevue, Washington. And my question is, I think most American Jews perceive President Trump as having brought out anti-Semitism. I'm a physician, like a bad virus or bacterial infection that's gone totally out of control. Yet here in Israel, my relatives on the left, right, and here at Hartman, they all think highly of President Trump and everything that he is doing for Israel. And we heard today that he may have a very reasonable peace plan. So I'm wondering if you can comment on that diversity.
Great. In the back.
Hi, I'm Danielle from Los Angeles. Given that our community has people with lots of different identities at once, in addition to their Jewish identity, I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit about how anti-Semitism is playing out differently for people who are Jews of color, people who are Jews and are also LGBTQ, Jews who are holding more than one identity at once, and how that anti-Semitism is playing out uniquely for them.
Great. Is there another one? Right. Don't run.
Okay, thank you. Bob Lenoble from Cincinnati. You touched on this at the very end. To what degree do you think the Jews as being perceived as weak, not fighting back, contributes to the rise in anti-Semitism?
Okay. In terms of the perception of President Trump, I think you're right. It's a very different perception. I think that for many Americans, it's not just a perception of policy vis-a-vis Israel, but it's many, many, many other things. And I think that, it's, I don't know if it's right, left, and center and every place else, but it certainly is a discordant kind of thing. And in many cases, I think it's highlighting some of the gaps between diaspora Jewry and Israel in that sense. I have no answer for it, but I think you've honed in on something that is really there. It's not in your imagination at all. Danielle's question about anti-Semitism playing out in different communities, I think you're right. We forget that the Jewish community, in Israel, it's hard to forget it, but I think sometimes we do forget it even here in Israel. But certainly in the United States is not all white, certainly not all straight, and it plays out differently for different groups. I think for Jews of color, this is a very difficult time. I think when they sit, it's almost a schizophrenic time, because if they sit with their fellow Jews at Shabbos lunch or Friday night dinner or whatever, they're sort of there, and no, not all blacks feel that way, and not all blacks follow Farrakhan, et cetera, et cetera. And when they're with African-American friends, they're the Jew. And it's a very, very difficult situation. I think it's not only for the sake of anti-Semitism, but I think for the sake of the health and the thriving of our community, we should realize that Jews come in many different colors, orientations, shapes, sizes, et cetera, et cetera. And there are many people, I think she was a fellow with you, Angela Buchdahl. I'm just mentioning her because she's been someone who's been so prominent, and she's also a very good friend. And Josh Feigelson just tweeted about the two of us. But you get that, that everyone has that expectation. And I think it really behooves those of us who are white and, Ashkenazi majority or whatever it might be, to remember that and be, again, well aware of it. Not in a simpatico way and not in a condescending way or patronizing way, but that's who our community is. We're a community of many different fabrics. So again, I'm glad you put that on the table. And finally, the perception of Jews as weak gives rise to anti-Semitism. I'm not sure. If anything, I think there's a flip. Not wanting to be perceived as weak, we sometimes respond in strength and in a way that may be overstating the case. And I'm well aware of the Talmudic teaching. In fact, it was something that was very crucial to me to my years of legal troubles and legal travails. Haba lecha lahargecha, hashkem lahargo. When somebody comes to kill you, get up early and kill them first. Defense, where people who does not believe in thou shalt not kill, we believe in thou shalt not murder, And yet, on the other hand, I think it's so necessary, and I know I've been saying this over and over again, but so many of you are involved in leadership positions in your communities, in your synagogues, in organizations and things like that, to think strategically. Not, is this going to make me feel good? I gave it to them. But is this going to serve the purpose of what we're about?
We'll take one more round. Go ahead.
So I'm David Stiefel from Seattle. My question is really, beyond BDS on campus, what about the professors on campus and the perception that a lot of the anti-Semitism, anti-Israel, anti-Zionism is coming out of the academy?
Great. In the last row. Ray? Ray? Right in front of you?
It was a very similar question, so I put my hand down, but just to do a follow-up, in terms of curative, are there things that not only university professors, but there are many Jews that have positions of influence in the universities, in the halls of the boards? What are the things that we as the Jewish people involved in university life can do to help the students? So exactly a follow-up on that, both at the university professor level and at the administration level.
Okay, do I have any college students who want to ask a question?
Oh my God. So sorry. Hi, I'm Zoe. I already asked a question tonight, but I was kind of wondering, you talked about how you disapproved of how Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez used Never Again. And I was also wondering, you also talked about how it's important to universalize the Holocaust so as not to diminish it. And I wasn't really clear on the distinction, so I was wondering if you could talk a little more about that.
Okay. All right. In terms of the campus, and we could spend the whole evening talking about the campus and not do the topic justice. I think it's very important to differentiate, and I forget who it was, I think in the back, you almost use the term anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism interchangeably. And sometimes we have to unpack what the person means by anti-Zionism. Is it criticisms of Israeli policies, which is not anti-Semitic. You go to the Knesset, and after they stop yelling at each other, if you can hear what they're saying, you'll hear severe criticisms of Israeli policies. Or is it something, it is questioning the, I would say, the right of the existence for the state of Israel, which I do find, and not everyone agrees with me, but I do find that to be anti-Semitic. Maybe there was room for debate about that in 1944, 45, 46, but we're now talking about a thriving state with, 7 million Jews in it. Where are they supposed to go? And with all due respect to what's her name, Helen Thomas, it's not back to Poland. So I think we have to differentiate there. In terms of reaching the professors, no board member or administrator is going to be able to threaten a professor, change a professor's opinion. That's why we have tenure. We have tenure as much as it's maddening. I love it, but as much as it's maddening, it's to protect people from that political influence, from that being silenced about things. You know, and there's even a limit to what boards can do and what administrators to do. You spent enough time in the university world to know that. I do think there are things that presidents can say and presidents can do. I think Andy Hamilton at NYU, when he said he would not have given that award to Students' Voices for Peace because they have been, if one thing, disruptive on campus. It wasn't his to take away from them, but I thought that that was a very powerful and important statement. Zoe, in the back there, I wrote down distinction, but about AOC, okay. I think that what upset me was the analogy to the Holocaust. That doesn't mean, I'm not saying, you know, that you can't make comparisons at all. I've been to Rwanda a number of times. I've worked with people in Rwanda against denial of the Rwandan genocide, which many Hutus have tried to do, and including Hutus who are perpetrators who have gotten out and settled in North America. By saying, who say, oh, this was just the Civil War, it was one side fights the other, and it goes on all the time, kind of thing. And you know, I think there are comparisons that can be made. I think in this case, as much as I abhor, am incensed by, see not only no justification, but so much beyond that for the way certainly the children have been treated. I mean, that just makes. The only sense it makes is if you want to make the lives of these people so horrible that they won't come. You know, but even then it doesn't make sense. It's not how a nation that considers itself a civilized nation behaves. But I do think it becomes, and here I speak as a historian, I do think it's important to make distinctions. Because if you begin to call everything a Shoah, a Holocaust, you begin to say, something can be horrible, again, as I said earlier, but let me stress it. Something can be horrible, something can be utterly unacceptable and not be a Shoah. And I'm not saying that the Shoah is unique unto itself. I think it is a genocide with many unique elements which make it different from many of the other genocide. I was, quite a few years ago, they now have a much larger museum, but I was in Cape Town, and I saw there, it was then a modest display, exhibit on the Shoah. I went through, in fact, with a group of South African policemen. They were all men who were going through a program there. And I remember standing with one of them in front of two pictures. One picture was the famous picture of a Nazi, which one assumes a doctor, a man in a white coat with a caliper measuring a little girl's nose. You've seen the picture, it's in many Holocaust exhibits. And clear, he was measuring, was this a Jewish nose or not? And next to it was a picture of a little girl with dark skin standing on a chair, and a man standing next to her. I believe he also had a white coat on, and he had put a pencil through her hair. and the man in the white jacket was white. And it was the pencil test. Anybody here from South Africa know the pencil test? It used to be a way that the South African apartheid regime would use to determine if someone was dark, but they couldn't determine whether they were colored or black, which under apartheid there was white, colored, black. Colored was a little bit better, than being black. They would put a pencil in the hair. And if the pencil fell out, the person was colored. If it stayed in, they were black. And this really happened. It's completely absurd. So I think there are mistreatments, and the apartheid wasn't a genocide because the South African regime needed those people alive to do the work to make it a very wealthy economy, certainly for the whites. But there's certain things that can be compared and certain things that stand alone. And I would say this anyway, but having, as I said, just I guess now it's 72 hours spent a day at Auschwitz-Birkenau, it sits on me very clearly that this is the only time we have in history. I mean, whether you were killed by, your family was killed by bullets or was killed in a gas chamber, they're dead and they were murdered because they were Jews. But nonetheless, one of the reasons we so focus on gas chambers is because bullets can be used to protect you or to murder someone. Or they can be used to get you food, or they've been used to murder someone. They have different uses. But gas chambers was the first time we had purpose-built instruments built by engineers, designed by engineers, with one purpose and one purpose only: to mass murder people. And using those machines and the gas buses and other things, other forms of, some were carbon monoxide, some were Zyklon B, etc., millions of people were killed. So I think that when you too easily compare, and even Jews do this sometimes, saying, "Oh, this is just like Germany in 1939." No, it's not. So they'll say, "Well, what about 35?" I say, "No, it's not." Give me 34. No. I think we have to be careful on those kind of comparisons. I say that as a historian, and I say that as a Jew as well. But I say it certainly as a historian, and I think it's important. So, and strategically, I think the conversation became off topic and didn't really help the issue.
So I'm going to use the moderator's privilege and ask you the last question, and it goes to something that I know that you like to talk about. Your book ends with almost a homily, and it's a little jarring, but I know you and I've heard you speak about this, that even after 220 or so pages on anti-Semitism, it was important to you that the last word be a reminder that the Jewish people are not constructed on the basis of anti-Semitism, and that anti-Semitism alone is not a sufficient anchor for what it means to be a Jew. But I want to go more tachlis, like tangibly. The thing that makes me, I would say, my biggest existential concern for the Hartman Institute is that 200 people flew here from America to study, from America and Canada, places all over the world, to study on ideas and issues that matter in shaping what it means to be a Jew in the modern world. They didn't come here to get terrified, because there's a lot of organizations and institutions in the Jewish community who traffic on fear. And I'm watching the way in which, as anti-Semitism rises in its significance again, that there's a huge philanthropic landscape that gloms onto that fear, because fear sells. So if you having studied this your whole life and having really devoted your academic and personal work towards this question, and you also don't want to make this an anchor of Jewish life, what are the tangible things that we as Jewish leaders can do in our communities to prevent the slippage of the anchoring principle of Jewish life being from a purpose-oriented life to a fear-oriented life?
In 3 minutes or less? As you know, the last chapter of the book is called Joy versus Oi, and I think that one of the things that we have to do is to be careful on those kind of comparisons. I say that as a historian, and I say that as a Jew as well. But I think we have to be careful on those kind of comparisons. I think the conversation became off topic and didn't really help the issue. So I'm going to use the moderator's privilege and ask you the last question, and it goes to something that I know that you like to talk about. Your book ends with almost a homily, and it's a little jarring, but I know you I felt it very important to do that. And I didn't plan on doing it in the beginning, but the more I wrote, and as things got worse and worse, I felt I had to include that. Because I worry. I worried about this long before the book, but I felt it really important to include it in the book. As you know well, there's Salo Baron warned us, and I was right near Tarnow, where he grew up, just when I was in Poland, warned us against the lachrymose conception of Jewish history, a tearful conception. The idea that Jewish history, certainly of the Middle Ages, is just pogrom, persecution, expulsion, but that there was a lot of very positive stuff going on, and a lot of very wonderful intellectual, socially, communally. Our whole communal structure grows out of that period, federations and everything else. And it's dangerous to only look at the bad. Or Shimon Ravidovich, who was the founder of the first Jewish Studies program in the United States, first Jewish Studies department at Brandeis University, who talked about Israel, the ever-dying people, how we always think of ourselves as we're the last, etc. And we're not. But I see that. I see how for many Jews, fear is what motivates them. But I used to be much more critical of that. It's not that I don't think that is a dangerous or a negative kind of thing, but I understand it better the more I've worked in the Jewish community, interacted with Jews in settings like this and many other places. Fear is the great equalizer. A woman walking down the street being followed by men saying things in the dark, alone, whatever, doesn't matter whether she's a feminist or not a feminist. She's afraid. You don't have to have a strong sense of your Jewish identity to be fearful of anti-Semitism. The Jews, the Nazis, I'll do this as in a shorthand, didn't go through and saying, you feel strongly as a Jew. People who didn't feel as Jews. There was churches. There were a number of churches in the Warsaw Ghetto, in part because the ghetto built around them, but the people who attended those churches because they thought they were Christians, and yet they were caught up in it. So they thought of themselves as Christians. So fear is a great equalizer. And yet, fear can be a great motivator, and in certain cases, you talked about the fundraising, people are using that, but I think they're also using that in an attempt, we're going to find some sort of program which will solve it. I'm not sure I know what program will, but I think there are efforts that can be made. But I think, what can we do? It's not fancy. It's not, highly digitized or whatever. We can learn what it means to be a Jew. And I mean that in all its manifestations, religiously, culturally, socially, however you choose to manifest it, but in an affirmative kind of way. We should be able to be as joyful dancing with the Torah, and I don't mean only dancing, but using that as a symbolic thing, as we are. As we cry on a Yom HaShoah or are crushed by visiting a death camp or something like that. But it takes work. I'm not saying that we don't do it, but it's hard. It's hard, especially as an adult. And we come from, where many of us, so many of us, certainly the people in this room, come from a socio-economic, educational outlook where we value competence. I never learned to play tennis because by the time I wanted to learn to play tennis, everybody I knew was good at tennis. So I said, I'll do racquetball. And also racquetball is indoors, so everyone doesn't see you making a fool of yourself as you do that. But we value competence. And many of us, I have friends who say, I don't want to go to that thing because I won't know what to do. I won't know how to behave, when to stand, when to sit. I say, sit in the back and just follow the rabbi or the person on the bima or whatever. But it's so important to not let ourselves, those who are at the helm of your different communities and organizations and are trying to impact change in the Jewish life, to think of being a Jew as object, what is done to Jews. its subject, what Jews do, and not to let anti-Semitism become the motivating factor. I have a friend, a prominent intellectual and activist in Jewish life, who was in 2 marriages. And in his first marriages, he was married, when he was first married, he had 2 boys, and he was, or a boy and a girl, and he was building his career. And he said, I didn't really have time to teach them Jewishly. I had moved away from my traditional roots. He had a pretty traditional background. So they really know very little about being Jewish, but I'm very proud of them, because if ever there's an attack on the Jews or there's an instance on campus or something, they are there. They're at the barricades. And then he said, and then I remarried and had a son with second marriage, and I had much more time, and we sent him to day school, and he knows, and he's comfortable, and he feels really comfortable as a Jew. And he was so proud of it, but he was so proud of his sons who didn't have that background, who still, and my heart was breaking. Because for them, being Jewish was defending. They had been deprived, or they had not been given the opportunity, not by any diabolical means, but that's the way it had worked out, of rejoicing in who they were. One of the ships, I know you know this well, like the ships of the Exodus of Aliyah Bet, was the Afal Pi Chen, the nonetheless. We sing in Eliyahu Hanavi, Afal Pi Sheyit Bamea, even though Eliyahu may tarry. It's not because of, it's despite. And I think especially now, even as we put our shoulders to the grindstone and try to figure out some way to deal with this issue, to address this issue, not to let it become the because of. And I'm going to close with an anecdote, which is in the book, but which I think it sits with me so powerfully, and I want to, those of you who read it know it, but if not, share it with you. And it happened a couple of years ago, before Pittsburgh. My shul has had a guard in front of it for quite a while. And I was walking into shul with 2 friends of mine, a mother in her late 30s and a little girl then aged about 4 or 5 years old, something like that. And they're neighbors, and I'm very close with them, and I read, whenever I'm in Atlanta, I read with the little girl every night before she goes to sleep. And we even sometimes do it over Skype. And as we walked into the shul, the mother said to her daughter, Shai, say thank you to the police officer for keeping us safe. And Shai looked at her mother in utter confusion, because for her, shul is her happy place. She comes to shul in the morning with her father or mother, and they go into the sanctuary, and she peels off to the playground. We have a giant play area and a very nice playground in the back, and she runs around like a maniac for 45 minutes, and then she and the other kids are gathered up and brought into children's services, which at her age consist of singing and games and getting snacks. And by then it's time to go into the main sanctuary and lead the congregation in Adon Olam, and then the rabbi gives them lollipops, no shortage of sugar in this shul. And then they go to the Kiddush, and if you walk into a Kiddush with a kid 4 or 5, or walk into a room with a kid 4 or 5 and there are 250, 300 people there, you would say, okay, you can go to the table, but stay in my line of sight. I don't want you running off. I want to be able to see you. But not in this setting. In this setting, we all know each other. We all, the kid. And the kids run around and they make it to the Kiddush table, and as soon as Kiddush is over, they're filling their plate, and they're filling it with chips and cookies and olives and I don't know, and nothing resembling protein will cross their lips. And then it's time to go home. And they have had the most fabulous 3 hours. That's their happy place. And suddenly now her mother is saying to her, thank the officer for keeping us safe. And she knows about unsafe places. By that point, we were well into Roald Dahl, and peaches flattening people, and chocolate factories devouring people. And by the way, we don't buy Roald Dahl books because he was a flaming anti-Semite. We only take them out of the library. And better when we can borrow them so that the library won't buy more of them, etc. But she knows about safe and unsafe places, and she was utterly confused. And on the night of Pittsburgh, she said, I asked her mother, I said, what did you, because everybody was talking about it, Shomer Shabbos family, so after everyone, by the end of the day, people knew, and televisions were blasting. What happened? What happened in that shul? So the challenge we face is all those little shies out there, that being Jewish should not be a scary thing. You know, people are saying we prepare our kids to go to campus to fight the anti-Semites. That's not the sum total of their experience, nor should it be. The idea is to see it as an affirmative thing that, yes, at times makes you a potential object of attack, but not because of. So, you know, it's to find that challenge. It's that chazak ve'ematz, be strong and of good courage, and rejoice in who you are. And I think that's the small stuff. So it's not, yes, you can go home and plan programs and in schools and the federations and whatever organizations, and they're all important. But also go home and start with the people in your household and beyond. Thank you very much.
Please join me in thanking Dr. Deborah Lipstadt.